In this episode, we talk to Gordon from Bushcraft Survival Australia. And inside, he shares some really interesting insights around his experience working in the worlds of bushcraft and survival all around the world. We dive into a few very interesting topics which we've never really touched on this podcast before, but I think is just so valuable for any hiker who's interested in getting out into the bush, getting out into some slightly more unexplored places and really just getting into their outdoor adventures. So a fantastic episode, really interesting insights, and I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this. So as that being said, let's get into it. Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. All right, hello. Welcome, Gordon, to the show. Really looking forward to having you on board. How are you going today?
I'm really great, Rowan. Thanks very much for having me on the program. I'm really excited to sit and have a chat with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited for this chat today. And as we were sort of saying before we started the recording, I think after so many hundreds of episodes on this podcast, we've never really explored what we're about to explore today. So I think it's going to be really interesting to get into. So I guess to kick things off, do you just want to give us just a bit of background? Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what do you do?
Sure, Rowan. Okay, it's a bit of a varied background, but my name's Gordon Dedman. I'm the senior instructor at Bushcraft Survival Australia, which is an outdoor education school that teaches bushcraft survival, varying courses. I've done a lot of training overseas. For that, I'm also a military survival instructor, ex-First Commando Regiment, by way of a couple of other units, and currently a survival instructor in North Force, which is a regional force surveillance unit in Northern Australia, up in Darwin, and we do lots of work in remote areas, and we have a lot of Aboriginal soldiers, so I get to spend a lot of time in Aboriginal communities, and they're the groups are the Eyes and Ears of the North, of which survival plays an important part. I'm also a combat SEER instructor, Survival Evade Resist Escape, which is I teach quite regularly at the Air Force Combat Survival Training School. Different sort of survival that we do in the Army, but it's a tri-service course, but it's about teaching the air crews how to survive sort of mishaps on the ground in a peacetime environment, and then of course how to evade capture and then affect the survival in a hostile situation whilst people are trying to hunt them down. So we go through those sorts of things. So that's the military side, and done a lot of training overseas with bushcraft and survival schools overseas, which are huge in Europe and in UK, and there's some of the best schools in the world are over there, which is an interesting topic in itself. And and so basically I formulated this school. There hasn't been a lot of schools in Australia, and I've been doing that for many years. And the other half of my life, believe it or not, I was a professional trumpet player, musician, and so I actually went through university and studied as a trumpet player. So I've lived two different lives, sitting and doing theatre shows on one end, and then jumping out of helicopters and planes and running around the bush, doing other things, as well as a bit of outdoor guiding here and there in Kakadu and in various places of long hikes and that sort of thing with clients and different things. So there's a whole mix of things really, and bits of martial arts thrown into that, jiu-jitsu and kickboxing over the years as well. So it's quite a mixed bag.
Absolutely. Big things there. So out of curiosity, how did that all filter into, I guess, focusing on bushcraft and survival? Like how did that road go for you?
Rowan, growing up in country New South Wales, I was always interested in the bush, and I had an Aboriginal mate. His father was, always talking about, I was just fascinated with Aboriginal culture, actually, and how people lived. And that, which was part of the reason why I wanted to move up to Northern Territory at the time to learn a lot of those skills. And I suppose I was always building rafts and shelters in the creek and, making fires as a kid and doing all the things which a lot of kids don't get to do today because it's all on the devices and things. But in the country, we'll had to make our own farm. And it was always, what if, how do you deal with not much? And I was in Scouts and Cubs, and I just always just loved anything to do with the bush and not having equipment, but being able to generate, okay, how do I make that in the bush without having to take an item into the bush? And that led down a path of being interested in survival skills, the SAS handbook by Lofty Wiseman, a lot of those types of things. And that led me to join the military and the Special Forces Unit, 1st Commando Regiment. I went in there initially to do some survival, but the military units, Army doesn't do loads of survival. You do field craft. It's only certain units that do survival training, and that's SAS and Commandos and Norforce and the Air Force Combat Survival Training School. That's it. You don't really do specific survival training at all. So that's a specialist course. But I went there to do that. And so, and then, of course, that took a lot of the trumpet playing took me overseas, travelling around, working on the ships, Cunard and that type of thing, the Queen Elizabeth, that line of ships. And I was lucky enough to do survival training and bushcraft courses all around the world. Some of the top schools, after a contract, I'd just stay in that country and do a survival course. And, of course, being over there in Alaska, did lots of hikes and things all around the place and just practicing skills in different countries. Because essentially they're all the same skill sets. It's just the environment and the resources change. And, of course, a couple of hairy situations here and there where some of those skills really came in, to help out with some stuff. But, yeah, that's sort of how I sort of got into it. But I just love being in remote places, out in the bush, and I don't really feel comfortable in cities, even though my life as a trumpet player is completely opposite, and it's a bit of a contrasting yin and yang, but it sort of has made life exciting as well and got the best of both worlds.
So in the episode today, we're going to be diving into this in a little bit of detail and getting into some topics around survival and bushcraft. But I guess before we get into that, could you just define the difference between survival and bushcraft?
That's a great question, Ryan. It's a thorny one. Generally speaking, they're the same skill sets. Survival deals with emergencies. It's something's gone wrong. Predominantly equipment-based, and it's some about getting out of that situation, that isolating event, whether it's a plane crash, vehicle accident, being lost, navigational error, which we call in the military being geographically embarrassed, losing your way, broken down vehicle, whatever the isolating event, it's getting out of that and then back to civilization, essentially, in the fastest way possible. And the skill sets are the same, where bushcraft would be the same skill sets, but it's a much deeper philosophical connection to the environment, like a far deeper knowledge of plants. Essentially, all survival bushcraft skills are Indigenous skills from around the world. The military, after World War II, particularly with lots of pilots dying unnecessarily, not from their primary injuries, lots of people were died unnecessarily, so they looked into, or how can we keep people safer once they survived the primary incident, and so they looked into doing survival training, which was taking Indigenous skills and codifying them into manuals, very sort of brief overviews of what to do in shorthand. So that led to survival manuals and hence survival training for the military. But bushcraft, essentially, which comes from woodcraft, woodsmanship, and really they're just all Indigenous skills. It's just a modern word. And it's taken those sort of, it's the big picture that survival comes from, except bushcraft, which you say isn't an emergency, survival is, and of course the biggest thing is location and rescue, getting rescued, where bushcraft would be about living comfortably in the land with a far deeper it's a deeper set of skill sets, of which sort of survival, you could say, shorthand, but it's an emergency, but it has a much deeper philosophical connection with the environment and, being part of it. You're not like survive at all costs, man against the wild, man against the bush, which is, of course, anyone that pits himself up like that against the bush, is going to run into trouble, because it's about respecting it and working with nature, not against it. And I guess that's probably the thing. It's working with nature at a slower pace and having a deeper connection to it, rather than, just trying to get away from it in any way possible. All the TV shows sort of mention that. And I forgot to mention I'm also the survival consultant for Alone. So I do all there's a lot of the safety stuff for that, the selection of the areas, and as well as the contestants and things like that. So a lot of the programs we have is sort of geared towards the survival aspect, but there is a deeper philosophical connection with the bushcraft side. But essentially, they are the same skill sets. It's probably a long-winded answer but it is quite a thorny question, actually. But and of course the words will change, no doubt, in years to come. It'll be turned into something else, no doubt.
So on this podcast, everyone who's listening to this will be a hiker in one way, shape or form. So whether they're just going out for day hikes for a few hours, whether they're doing overnighters and multi-days, or even some people doing the more like hardcore multi-month adventures. Would there be any particular survival or bushcraft skills that you would recommend that pretty much all hikers, regardless of their situation, should probably be aware of or know or have, or however you define it?
Well, on our courses, and we have a variety of courses, our fundamental module 1 and 2 and intermediate courses, we always start out teaching people the survival things first, in which, even though I said they're essentially the similar skill sets, looking at the priorities of survival, which are the PLAN acronym: protection, location, acquisition, and navigation. Protection being first aid, clothing, shelter, and fire. Location being attracting, holding, and directing attention, so rescue. The acquisition of water and food, then food, so finding water, making it safe to drink, finding food, making it safe to eat, which of course the food being the last in the priorities in a survival situation. And then navigation, being able to navigate, and if it's, you always stay with the vehicle or the plane crash, only move as a last resort. And, of course, navigation using map and compass, but, of course, being celestial navigation, knowing what the sun's doing, using solar methods as well, aids to navigation we do. Because in an emergency situation, you may not have some of those. So as far as a hike is concerned, knowing what to do in what order is really, really important. So our Mod 1 deals with a lot of that stuff when you have equipment. And a lot of people run into trouble because they don't know what to do once their equipment fails. And it's very important that knowledge and skills trump equipment. Having all the equipment in the world, many people have perished and they've gotten in trouble from hikes and other things because they don't have the knowledge and skills. They just know how to use their equipment, but take it away and they're in trouble. So we teach skills, how to use a knife, being able to make things, being able to make fire, firstly with modern methods, ferro rods and things like that, under all conditions. Rain, hail, shine, wind, being able to erect emergency shelters, things like that. And of course, water procurement, how to make water safe to drink, how to find it, how to make it safe to drink through filtration, and then boiling, not just relying on a gadget or a device, which is great. But once it stops working or you lose it or something, then your knowledge and skills needs to come to the fore. So we teach all that sort of stuff without equipment-based first, and then as the courses progress, we take away some of those skills. Or, how do you make string? How do you make a fire if you don't have matches or a ferro rod? How do you make a natural shelter to get you out of harm's way and stay in that, protect against heat loss, the 5 heat loss gain mechanisms? So all of those things we teach on our basic courses, and we get a lot of hikers that come to do that want to do solo trips and that's just like basic skills, and using say the 5 to 10 essential items, of which are, other than the clothing for the environment, being properly dressed and having the right clothing and being able to manage that clothing, which is absolutely essential. More people die from exposure than anything else. It's just obviously having a cutting tool, an effective sort of cutting tool, because knowledge and skills, you can do everything with a proper cutting tool. A good combustion device and knowing what to do without it, or how to make fire without it. A container being absolutely essential to boiling water, a metal container, having a metal container is essential. Many things you can do with that. A covering, some sort of emergency covering. It's not a tent or a hoochie or a tarp. Those sorts of things. And, of course, your clothing is your first line of defence against the environment. But you need to know how do you make a shelter if you don't have that. And cordage. Cordage, we use it all the time. So for everything, but, how do you make cordage if you don't have it? So they're like 5 essential skill bases, so in clothing, cutting tool, combustion device, covering, container, and cordage, those being the top 5 because they're the most difficult and hard to produce in nature. That's what we focus on our Mod 1 skills, which should be the focus of any sort of person going into the outdoors remotely, because once your equipment fails, that's what you have. Other than that, other equipment would be, say, cloths, bandanas, because you can use cotton for all sorts of first aid uses and things like that. But you should never improvise on purpose. Always have the proper equipment with you. And then, so things like that. Other than that, obviously a compass, map and compass if you're going to environment. Duct tape, plenty of which is also part of your first aid kit, other than, proper tourniquets and a proper designated first aid kit for anything that happens. And people should have remote wilderness first aid training, which is, in the priorities of survival. That's the first of your protection element is first aid, and valid first aid training. Some providers are better than others, and it needs to be pressure tested and needs to work. And so those sorts of things, a EPIRB in the sense, but things like a Garmin, there's some great things like Garmin InReach, something with an InReach capability that actually you can text from, but you can also hit the emergency send in the cavalry button to get help. But you also have the means of texting, so if it's not as serious. So that's really important, and that's, with satellites, that's a fantastic, either the Garmin Mini or the Garmin 67i for hiking. That's why I use that a lot. I actually use that in alone as well with contestants if you have to, look for someone and things like that, because it's got its own maps. But, of course, you need to know how to use a map and compass, which in the military comes first. GPSs should be used to check position, not be the sole form of navigation at all, because too much reliance on technology is foolhardy as technology fails. So you have to have backups for backups. Other than that, things like dry bags and, of course, your food and your water. So though knowledge of how to use those basic items, as well as knowing what to use, every item should have 3 uses. If you can't use it for 3 uses, you probably need to think about something else. But, and of course, comfort being the last things you add. But knowing what to do in what order and how to use that essential equipment is paramount. And that's what we teach on our Mod 1 course. And we get a lot of hikers coming to do that because they're the things that they're going to need to know straight off the bat in remote situations, if something goes wrong, but also just gives them a, sense of confidence and, improving in how to, use natural navigation, find, direction with the sun and how shadows move, the way the sun moves and things like that can actually aid your navigation abilities by using other things rather than relying on a GPS. And that's the way natural navigation, using the stars, navigating with the stars, knowing how they move and the heavens work, sort of gives us a better knowledge of what's going on the ground and how to find your way. And all these things, they're all linked. They're all like come under the umbrella of bushcraft. But, yeah, so it's a thorough set of skills in an emergency situation. And then as you develop skills, emergency skills and, of course, rescue, all that sort of stuff with location, then you can start looking into more of the bushcraft things. Okay, you're here for a bit longer time. You can actually sort of settle in a bit more and making the tools you need instead of bringing them in. We have a saying, the more you know, the less you have to carry. So skills and knowledge and skills don't weigh anything, and that should be our main focus on developing skills and knowledge rather than having the latest shiny piece of equipment. And that's probably where I see the biggest fault, particularly in Australia, and particularly looking at the four-wheel drive industry. We've got pretty much all the gear and no idea. You've got so much equipment, but people just don't know any skills outside of it. So we're sort of trying to teach, of course, that's not everyone, but with a lot of our early explorers, two prime examples, Burke and Wills, for example, no knowledge and skills, not really any knowledge or respect of Indigenous culture, 20 tonnes of equipment, over a mile along, and they both perished. Funnily, that's natural selection, but that's same lack of knowledge and skills, say, compared to someone like John McDowell Stewart, who had travelled very light using only essential equipment, good navigator, good bushman. He was a surveyor, good respect for Indigenous culture and that type of thing at the time, and just a good knowledge of what he was doing. And he navigated from water source to water source, where Burke and Wills just went from A to B, hoping there'd be water. So, and that sort of mentality is still alive today in having all the equipment, but not having the knowledge and skills to back that up if something should fail. Yeah, so that's what we aim to teach on our courses, and that those primary skill sets are what we teach in the military to Army and Air Force pilots about, okay, you don't have your equipment, how do you get on? And how do you affect the priorities of survival in the correct order if something's happened unplanned.
So there's a lot of very, very interesting stuff in there, and I could pick your brains about that for hours and hours. But I guess keeping on track, there was one thing that I want to pick out of that which did jump out at me, and you're talking about the remote first aid and the sense of it being pressure tested, and I guess a couple of memories jump to mind there of like situations in my professional career where everyone is first aid qualified, something happens and it's never been pressure tested, and when actually something happened, all of that kind of learning fell apart. So I guess for a hiker listening to this, they're like, okay, maybe I've done a first aid qualification, or maybe I haven't quite done a remote first aid, or maybe I've done one but it wasn't really like too full on. In that type of scheme, like how would you look at pressure testing these skills if someone was doing it themselves, or if someone was trying to seek out a course which would, have this a part of it?
Well, and first aid, as I said, with the protection element, which is first aid, clothing, shelter, fire, because you'll die if, there's another thing known as the rule of threes, which isn't set in stone. And that's pretty much 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, food being the last of importance in a short-term survival scenario, definitely long-term. But it's not set in stone. But 3 minutes without air is immediate. If you're not breathing or bleeding uncontrollably, death is in minutes. So first aid is so important. And blood goes round and round, air goes in and out. So it's like keeping that system closed so that it can still function. The military, we do lots of training, obviously, for combat and what happens. And through conflicts around the world, they've got lots of training and particularly with the use of tourniquets, which haven't been used a lot, and even in Australia, but now they've proven to save so many lives. And some of our emergency services still don't use them, but it's catching up, and that's very, very valid training. In Bushcraft Survival Australia, we actually run a wilderness first aid course, and it's run by TACMed, which are all ex-military medics, and it's all pressure tested and scenario based. So you're putting on tourniquets under pressure, sometimes after jogging around, because once, say, for example, and it's all geared to what the sort of things that will happen in a remote wilderness area, using a knife or an axe, crush injuries, broken legs, things like that. And the difference is that you may be on your own. You may not be able. You can't just call Stand for help. You may need to manage that injury or walk out. So the training we do is geared towards those people. We have artificial limbs, spurting blood, which students have to put on tourniquets to stop the blood flow, where they have to make fires to keep people warm, imagine using an emergency blanket. use space blankets, but that needs to be put on close to the skin, not over the clothing. And a lot of courses have done with other providers don't teach that. It needs to be under the clothing, close to the skin for it to work effectively. And two of them keep people warm, and cost people that have lost a lot of blood will also more succumb to hypothermia as well, and shock, cold shock, all sorts of things. So you need to really keep people warm. So good first aid training, and I'm not a first aid provider myself, just done a lot of courses as well as the military. It needs to be pressure tested, and just like martial arts, if you train to pull punches, that's what you're going to do. You need to practice properly. And I know there are providers out there that some are just tick and flick type things, but you need to be outside in the environment doing those things and treating people on the ground, out in the bush, in the rain, in the water. Some of our scenarios, people are dragged out of the water and they're actually properly cold, and they, particularly the role models that need to be kept warm because they actually are cold, and the fire's lit in time, and it needs to be that sort of training. And if you're venturing into a remote area, solo hiking, you need to train first aid in a way that's realistic, and go through those things, and be thinking about the possibilities that you can't send for help and you need to manage that injury, or you may have to get out of there on your own if you're able to do so. So there's that as well. So that needs to be considered. So, so pressure tested, as I said, the military saying the way you train is the way you fight. So if it's not realistic and pressure tested, and a lot of our bushcraft activities and fire lighting are done under pressure, you've got 20 minutes to make a fire, set up a shelter and boil a litre of water from scratch using a ferro rod or something like that, where it could be wind coming in and weather coming in really quickly, where you need to get a fire going very fast before it shuts it down. We need to get dry, or you need to provide a warm drink for someone that's going down the hypothermia route. They're all skills that need to be pressure tested. If you're only practicing in the ideal environments, once you're suddenly put in austere environments or things that aren't that, all those things become a lot harder. And the greater the need for fire, the harder it is. So that can be applied, obviously, those principles to many, many things.
So you've obviously listed at this stage like a lot of different skills or areas or bits of equipment like that is very, very important with these types of things. But I'm curious, if we were to say breaking up remote adventures into different lengths and sort of say, hey, a hiker is wanting to go out for 2 to 3 days, or a hiker wanted to go out for maybe 4 days to a couple of weeks, or a hiker who wanted to go out for one of these multi-month adventures, would there be any skills or bits of equipment which you may highlight would be really important as we're kind of jumping up to these different lengths or different distances, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does, Rowan. So once again, a knowledge of the priorities of survival is important. Once again, the plan, protection, location, acquisition, navigation, and those areas, and having your kit that deals with that. And a lot of the survival kits you buy, and a lot of them are gimmicks. I'm not a big fan of survival kits because you should have different items. For example, everyone should, apart from the most important thing being adequate and correct clothing. So for hot environments, loose-fitting cottons to keep you cool. Cold environments, woolens and synthetics. Wool retains much of its essential value when it's damp, and it's brilliant stuff, and it's moderately fire retardant. So I always choose wools and synthetics dry quickly. A thorough knowledge of the heat loss gain mechanisms of conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation, respiration are really, really important, because not only for your clothing and how to manage the clothing, what clothing to buy, as well as when you're making a shelter, it needs to look after those things. So other than clothing, a knife, a cutting tool, with knowledge and skills, you can do everything with a knife, a good knife. And everything we own, live in, travel in has a cutting tool used in its manufacture. So we use a knife, and there's so many things to do. You can use with an appropriate knife. Of fire lighting, ferro rod, ferrocerium, something that isn't that. If you've got weather, cold, lighters don't work, you need a few different ways of making fire. There's a metal water container to boil water in. Many things. So you have a metal cooking pot. That's important. There's stainless steel metal cooking pots, stainless steel containers, to put nesting cups that you can, fit into pockets. Cordage, parachute cord can be opened up to use as sewing devices, to fix equipment, fishing line, trap making, a whole stack of things you can use proper parachute cord. And there are lots out in the market that actually isn't proper parachute cord. That's another topic. Bandanas, sheets of cloth. Cloth can be used for all sorts of things, 100% in cotton, multiple uses of large sheets of cotton. There's all of these things. Knowledge of how to use this essential equipment is all based around knowing what those priorities of survival. We have some of those on our website, blog, a few articles about what they are. And once you know what you need to do in what order, and you've got your kit selected based on it, that essential kit is the same for no matter what duration the hike is. And, for example, my 12-piece kit at a day pack, if I'm just going for 3 hours, I've always got that stuff, even going on an aircraft, minus the sharps and anything that you can't take on a plane. But in my pack, even if it's only 3 hours, I've always got extra warm clothing. I've got an extra, say, a thermal top or bottom, depending on the cold. I've always got an extra, say, woolen beanie, woolen socks. If it's colder, I might have extra. This is in addition to the clothing on the pack. I've got I've got a ferro rod, cutting tool, which could be a multi-tool. It doesn't mean something that's got some options, but good quality. A metal container of some description to boil water. I've got a few hanks of paracord, a couple of large 100% cotton bandanas for multiple uses, duct tape, a dry bag. Dry bags are great. For example, you can carry water in a dry bag. You can use it as a flotation device. You can store things in it, pillow. There's like multiple uses of a dry bag. Same as a large garbage bag or plastic garbage. Unfortunately, it's hard to get non-pleated bags in Australia, so I have to get them from overseas. You can use a large unpleated bag, single seal, for so many different things, from ponchos to shelters to insulated mattresses, and it fits in your pocket. In fact, a lot of these items will fit on the person, and rather than just in your pack, and you've actually got all those elements of survival there. A small first aid kit, your Garmin or your GPS, and of course a map, a compass around your neck, on your person, all of those things. I take that for 3 hours, for a 3-hour hike. And of course a head torch is another one thing. A head torch is really important because when people get lost, they usually, they probably don't want to admit they're lost until late in the day when they need it. So a good, reliable head torch and spare batteries is essential. And, of course, any food, snacks. But as I said, in a 72-hour situation with 3 or 4 days, food is the last of importance. You've got other priorities to deal with, but once they're taken care of, then you can worry about food. As the duration of the hike might improve, increase, you'd add comfort items that, going for a night, you might have a sleeping bag, lightweight sleeping bag, depending, applicable to the conditions, a bivvy bag to keep that dry, also to stop convective cooling through the wind, a shelter. Most of the time I live under a hoochie, which is just an army shelter, a tarp. I very infrequently use a tent, unless it's above the tree line in the wind, but most of the time a tarp is fine. You have a fire under a tarp. You don't get wet under a tarp. If you do, it's because you've set it up incorrectly in the wrong place. But so that's great, learning how to use those. We teach those on our courses. And so it's comfort items, and of course a sleeping mat to prevent heat loss through conduction, the cold ground. Knowing those heat loss gain mechanisms is essential, even just for comfort. So as the duration of the hike would go, I would add those comfort items. And to that is multi-day help. We're going to add food, lightweight food. In the military we use ration packs, but you can actually make ration packs. I've got a few examples of that on our YouTube channel, how to make a ration pack from what you buy in a supermarket, for multi-day hikes, cheaper options rather than buying the purpose-built stuff, which can be quite expensive. But there are options, healthy options to make your own based on the sort of military concept. And you can actually have a whole weeks' food. And, of course, with food procurement skills, trapping, of course, sticking to regulations and what you're allowed to do, you can then procure fishing, you can procure your own food. But unlikely to do that on a hike because you're in movement. You need to stay in an area to forage, for food. But if you've got knowledge of plants and that, you can supplement things from the environment you find. But you're on the move, so that's harder to do so. Water procurement, how to, if you know navigation, you should be including water sources in your route planning so that you can fill up and boil water. If you don't have the means to light a fire, or you're not allowed to, you'll need to have to carry some form of gas. So, and all those sorts of things. Or if you've got food that doesn't need cooking, can you have it cold and all that type of thing? So it depends on the route where you're going. And food and water being the heaviest, 1 kilo per litre of water. The military, we work on 6 litres a day in your pack. But up in northern Australia, you've got 4 litres on your webbing, 6 litres in your pack. That's 10 litres. That's a lot. That's 10 kilos alone just in water, plus mission essential equipment and things like that. But of course, if you've got the ability to procure water on your own, you don't need to do that. And that comes down to your navigation skills and being able to procure water. There are different ways, transpiration bags and getting water out of trees with plastic, clear bags. I've had to do that on a couple of occasions for real. And those things are lifesavers, and knowing how to get water out of saplings. And many people have perished in the Aussie bush unnecessarily because they didn't know how to find water that's been right there in saplings. There's small amounts, but knowing how to do those things is important. Once again, knowledge and skills trumps equipment. So it's important. So all of those items, I have the same in my day pack for whether it's a 3-hour trip. Those same items are in it for whether it's a month long. All that I add to it is comfort items or extra food or some food procurement options, whether it's a fishing kit or things like that. And so it's smaller in miniature for my smaller pack, but they're all the same items are there for larger hikes and things like that, where you've got that always there, but you've got that base level of equipment. And, of course, the knowledge and skills of how to do without it. So if you've lost your fire, okay, how can you make fire without matches and things like that? How can you don't have any cordage, how can you make it using the plants around you and a knowledge of that? You can really take that down to another level. And, of course, there's, the course we're running a course right at the moment with Dr. Teresa Camper where we're doing animal processing using kangaroos and making bone tools, and we out of a whole animal, and the things you can do from what's right in front of us, and everything's there, just knowing how to use it. And, it's just a matter of knowledge and skills once again. Hopefully that answered that question. As once again, a long-winded answer. But it depends on how long you're going for, but the essential equipment remains the same. It's just adding to that with comfort items.
And then I know that obviously for our listeners, we've got people based in Australia, but also people quite around the world, and I would assume that certain recommendations probably do change in different parts of the world. So, just off the top of your head, are there any distinct differences in regards to these topics of survival and bushcraft that you see in Australia compared to other parts of the world?
Good question. Some of the wording can be different. For example, on our courses, we don't really do prepping. You've got I'm not sort of a fan of the sort of zombie apocalyptic paranoia that exists elsewhere. There's sensible emergency preparedness, and that's more what we deal with. But there's one thing in sort of survivalism over in the state can be something different. So, so as I said, there's quite a large prepping. I'm not sort of down there, as I said, we look at sensible emergency preparedness with those things. So, bushcraft, for example, that word's used more in the UK than say what it is in the States. There's a thing called primitive skills, which I don't really like the term, but lots of which is another step beyond bushcraft, which uses a mix of modern tools and equipment with many traditional skills. The primitive skill is like, okay, you don't have a knife, you need to flint knapp your own knife. you're doing everything all traditionally, like, almost like using Stone Age technology, and it is a technology, and it is an amazing amount of skill. We tend to frown upon, cultures of the past because they didn't have all the modern equipment, but their knowledge of the environment, the plants, and to do that, to me, far exceeds our knowledge of equipment. I mean, it's almost like being dumbed down by technology today, where people don't know how to even tie their own shoes anymore, and it's frightening. With the devices, too much reliance on technology by far, and people don't know what to do without it. So knowing how all these skills have been around for thousands, our whole history, is that, but we've literally lost it in the last 50 years, and it's getting worse and worse. So that's one thing. And there's a big resurgence of that. I did a lot of my bushcraft training in the Europe. Funnily enough, the best schools are in Europe and in the States that I've seen. In Australia, there's not many schools, and I think a lot of Australians take the bush for granted, all these wild open places, but there's not many bushcraft schools. And maybe it's because in Europe they don't have as many, and it's a very different depth of knowledge that I've seen in Europe, and that's why I did my training. I personally thought it was a much higher standard and very detailed. And as you know, every Aussie's an expert, and that was sort of the attitude that I sort of got from when I was over there. And there's schools everywhere, very, very good ones. So I went and did my training mostly in Europe and in the States to get a lot of the bushcraft survival. But it is growing and it's changing now, and that sort of hunger for looking after yourself, self-reliance and how to look after yourself is really, really important. So I'm seeing that difference. A lot of people coming out of courses because they want to reconnect with nature. They want to learn plants, plant identification, but then huge in resources, because that's pretty much the heart of everything. It's your resources. But to a lot of people, it's just green stuff that gets in the road. But which plants not only can you eat, water indicators, fuel, string making. Like there's a supermarket out there, but it's it's all plants. That's pretty much most of everything. Very, very important skill sets, plant identification. So there's all that sort of thing. And the other reason people are getting tired of the system. That's what a lot of people say. We live in a world with finite resources, yet we live in a system that demands constant expenditure, cyclical consumption and just exponential growth and consumerism. And it's a complete odds with the natural world that we live in. And I think people know that. A lot of people are saying that on the courses. And as I said, they're wanting to learn, how can I look after this? And I think we all know that inherently. So there's something very wrong, and this needs to be addressed. We've got one planet, we need to look after it. And I think the very system we're living within is at odds to it. And that's the other thing I'm seeing. And all around the world, the courses have done. These are teaching self-reliant skills, how to look after. Like our parents had the ability to be much more, self-sufficient. And with technology, our dependence on it is becoming far too great. I feel it's really important to have. Of course, we need to know everything about it, but I just think it's out of balance. We need to have that with some effective knowledge and skills. And I see that at school as well. We teach some school courses, and just the general knowledge of what kids have growing up. What we had is getting less and less and less, and sometimes frightening with once again the over dependence of technology. And so a lot of schools around doing that. So there's really brilliant schools in all around Europe, and I frequently go over there to train. And you're always, I'm an eternal student. You never stop learning. I don't really like the word expert. No one's an expert, and I think people that apply the word expert to themselves have stopped learning. So you're always a student. You're forever a student learning. And I learn from our students. People come from all sorts of walks of life on our courses, and meet some amazing people with different skill sets. And it's fascinating. And so I encourage everyone goes and does different courses with different people around. But there's a number of schools growing in Australia. There are some charlatans popping up as well, probably from the Alone as well. But I sort of see that. But Alone's done a great job in attracting people to the outdoors as well. It just needs to be responsible. The other thing we do on our courses, Rowan, is all of these skills we teach environmental stewardship, and that is not only having all those sort of skill sets, it's like, how do you do it safely for the environment? All our courses are under a parachute, and a lot of the courses are done in the bush, fully in the bush overseas. And we teach, how to use a latrine, how to burn your toilet paper responsibly and safely, because it takes ages to break down. Burn your business, your waste, and that breaks down in just weeks. Less sometimes, depending on the soil. It's actually quite, we have latrines and some it's all done within 3 months. And you can actually do that. And as an outdoor guide, and particularly I was always frustrated by the amount of toilet paper I see on hiking trails, and it's unnecessary because it's something that should be taught in schools. We have a couple of videos on the YouTube channel of how to go to the toilet in the bush responsibly, and I think every hiker, every four-wheel drive person needs to know how to go to the toilet in the bush. And if you can't do that and wipe your burn your toilet paper safely, if it's safe to do so, then you need to carry it with you and take it back. But everyone leaves it there, and I see that problem being, from what I've seen in Australia, particularly bad. But I don't see that in Scandinavia, in some of those countries where that's taught at school, and it should be taught here as well. And I think with people going out into the bush, and it's great that people are getting out into the environment wanting to do stuff, but there needs to be an education with that about how to look after the area and clean up. And that's one thing I'd love to see more of, and we sort of teach that on our courses as well, how to leave a fire and leave no trace. There's no such thing as no trace, there's minimal trace. And how to clean up responsibly. For example, in Sweden, they have a law called Allemansvetten, which is the right to roam. You're allowed to camp, and any Swedes listen, forget my pronunciation, but for I go over there quite regularly, and you can camp on private property as long as it's not within 100 metres of a dwelling or 200 metres. You can camp for a few days, and people clean up. They know how to leave a fire, and then basically let it burn down to ash, and then dispose of the ash, scatter it about, and so it's soft to the touch, and then camouflage the area, taking any rubbish with you. And it's actually in bushcraft, it's frowned upon to leave unburnt pieces of wood. It means you haven't timed your fire. So we teach all those things, and so to leave the trade. And I find a lot of our laws we have in Australia exist because people don't know how to do the right thing. And so that's all we're trying to do on our courses, teach some of those things, not just the survival skills, but, okay, how can we teach the skills but also leave no trace, so it can leave it respectfully for the environment and also for the other people coming behind them, so they've left no trace. There's no unburnt, unsightly pieces of burnt wood, toilet paper and rubbish, which would be common sense to take with you, but sadly it's not. So there's all those things, and I guess I learnt a lot of those things overseas, not so much here, because in Europe particularly, and in England with a lot of the bushcraft schools, they're very big. Ramir's a school, Woodlaw and Paul Kirtley, I've done many of his courses overseas. They teach all of those skills. Very, environmental stewardship is forefront, and so we add that to. We're very big on that. But yeah, different schools, survival training skills, bushcraft skills, and I guess we're an amalgamation of all of that. It's environmental stewardship is a huge part of it.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about Bushcraft Survival Australia in just a second. But I guess for my listeners who are based over the USA, the UK, or maybe through Europe, is there any one you may recommend that they may source information or look into courses in those parts of the world?
In the UK, I did a lot of Woodlaw School, which is Ray Mears. He was a BBC presenter, very high standard. Imagine David Attenborough of bushcraft, and very respectful with respect for Indigenous cultures. I did a lot of courses at Woodlaw School years ago. Paul Kirtley, also an ex Woodlaw instructor, head of operations there. He runs an excellent school called Frontier Bushcraft, very, very high standard, and he's like the bushcraft scientist, and we host him. He comes over every couple of years. Fantastic school. There's quite a few schools in the UK, some very, very good ones. And bushcraft is huge over there. They even have a bushcraft show where they have, massive. I mean, they do have a larger population, but there's like it's a big following over there. And they don't have the areas that we have. Go figure. It's very quite strange, but very good standard of schools. In the States, I've done a few courses. The Pathfinder still is great. The Boulder Outdoor Schools, or BOSS, has some wonderful, some of the best instructors in the world there as well. They do a lot of the primitive skill sets, and they have a meet once a year called Rabbit Stick. Some really good standard of instructors there. There's some great schools in Canada. Mors Kazansky, who's the father of Canadian bushcraft, sadly died a couple of years ago. And there's some Karamat Wilderness Ways, which does a lot of that. Some very, 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 very detailed, good quality schools exist. And so, yeah, by all means, there's some in Australia. There's many different schools. I did a lot of early on with Bob Cooper, Outback Survival in Western Australia, and there's some great schools everywhere for those. Check those out. Check out the reviews. Look at the credentials of the instructors. See what their background is, because there are some charlatan ones as well that are popping up, sadly. And Alone has done that with lots of people that don't have the necessary training, and there isn't an award for bushcraft or survival like there is for canoeing and that. So you need to do your homework. There are a lot of military good survival schools out there as well, which of course teach more of that type of thing. And of course we do both at the school, being a military survival instructor, and a both. So we have a mixture of both. And that's what I'd say as far as overseas. Yeah, just check out. They're some of the top ones I can recommend. That have some good things to learn.
Fantastic. And then for the Aussie listeners now, could you tell us just a little bit more about Bushcraft Survival Australia?
Yeah, Rowan. So I guess from doing lots of courses overseas and sort of frustrated that there wasn't a lot of schools in Australia, and partly due to the Aussie attitude of being, I'm an expert and that she'll be right, which was an attitude I always hated. I thought there's got to be more to here. So I went over there and I just found some school where I was just blown away. So, and with my travelling as a trumpet player on the ship site and hiking, and when I was doing lots of stuff, I just did a plethora of courses over about, 13 years of just, I was just a survival bushcraft course junkie. I just did courses everywhere all around the world. So I brought those back, and I was also a school music teacher at school, so I have a teaching background. So teaching for me is something I'm really passionate about, and I did a lot of outdoor ed teaching as well. I was a trained teacher, so that was really important to me to be able to teach well. And I wanted to have the standard of what I saw overseas, but adapted to Australian environments, and coupled with my military survival training, which is different. I use some of the pressure testing that we do in the military, and things that I've got from other schools. Some of the Pathfinder tests are great, and I use some of those at State Canterbury School, and of course just with the level of detail that I've from a lot of the schools in Europe. And I put that all as a mix into the using the Australian resources and in our climate. And it's an amalgamation of all of that, and with a bit of military type stuff, the essential stuff, and that's why it's called Bushcraft Survival Australia. A lot of the heart and the passion and the philosophical connection to the land, but you need to learn important survival skills, which are emergency skills. You need to learn those first, and our courses are structured. So Mod 1, which is 3 days, 3 nights, in the bush the entire time, so it's under a parachute. First night where they can use a tent, and it's for all people that don't have any experience, but it's not easy. Mod 1 is definitely not easy. We do the theory. It's the flagship course that all our other courses come from, and everyone needs to do that course because it's quite different than other courses. And some people come back to do the course multiple times. It's different. Every course is different in the sense that there's always something new to learn. And so, the important theory components which are taken from military instructions, important stuff. So Mod 1 is all about using that equipment, the essential equipment, the priorities for survival. It's all based around the priorities of survival, and it ignites indigenous cooking, without cooking pots on fires, basic fire lighting, shelter building, using equipment and tarps, how top new to essential knot tying, and how to set up your tarp, live under a tarp, using equipment to navigation, introduction to natural navigation, the sun and the stars, signalling and rescue, those sorts of things, getting out of harm's way, all the basics. And then there's an activity on the final day where we put that to pressure, where there's an individual test of putting up a shelter with the knot shown under pressure, lighting a fire, boiling water, using a ferro rod and natural tinder in a timed sense, because you need to do things under pressure. And it's when under pressure, that's when things go wrong. And, of course, it's a guide just to see how you're going, and then we come together and do a signalling activity for rescue. And it's all done in a time, and we do lots of pressure-timed tests because people are tired over the 3 days. That's essential, but we do it, and it's very safely managed. We have a nice, tight camp, very, very clean and organised, and we teach a lot of that as well. The good organised camps, and all kit is good organised, your mindset's organised as well. And so we teach all those skills, but they're pressure testing and planned identification, all of those things. And then as the courses progress, Module 2, some of that equipment disappears. Okay, we teach, some friction fire methods. They live in a natural shelter for a couple of days. They improvise water collection, which they do in Mod 1 too, using military bags to water purification, filtering. Great kit item, a millbank bag to take with you on a hike, because you can just filter water and then boil it straight away, or whether you're using gas rather than relying on a fancy bit of high-tech gear that does everything. You need to know what the fire water contaminants are, which is, turbidity, parasites, protozoa, bacteria, viruses, and chemicals. Nice to have a device that does everything, but if that device fails, you need to know, what's the main components, what do I need to get rid of? So technology is great, but you need to have a backup in case. So we teach all that on Mod 1, and as the courses progress, the items diminish. And then, okay, how do you make string in the bush? And we take some things away, but it's all gradual, and different cooking methods as well. How to cook without cook pots, and basically it's about, as the bushcraft takes over, as the survival something, and the long term, the more in-depth plant knowledge, and how to make the tools that you need rather than have to carry them in, pot stands and all these different notch and cut, how to use knives properly to make notches and hooks and shelters, because then you can make everything you need. You don't have to carry it in. And then Mod 3 is our intermediate, and that's where it's in context, and that's where things are more pressure tested, where you're living in a natural shelter for an entire week, hand drill, and more advanced, you don't have a cooking pot. How do you make a cooking pot to hold water and then hot rock boiling it? If you don't have the ability to do that, how do you do that? So we take away some of those things, and the skill sets get deeper and deeper, and eventually we're not running our advanced yet, but that will be in a remote area, pressure tested by that. And we have our wilderness first aid course, which is done in conjunction with TACMed, which are ex-military medics, and you get your apply first aid in remote environments, all those same awards and certifications. It's just done in a really practical way, very realistic training. So the students have to have those sorts of skills. And we have a couple of an international person that comes out every year. At the moment, Teresa Camp is here, and she was a lone season 8, also experimental archaeologist, and they're doing a 7-day use the whole animal course, and hide tanning, and some basketry, and a whole stack of things thrown in there with a lot of more the primitive skills, when we have these sort of specialist skills which all are part of the same thing, just a different focus. And we're always looking to add different courses. We'll be adding a 2-day navigation course probably next year. And so the pretty much it's designed to give people a base. It's very structured, and our website has all those details on, and we've got a few YouTube videos. There's actually a video on YouTube we just put up recently, which is sort of highlights of our Mod 1. Some of the things you'll learn, but it's immersive. And, of course, all the environmental stewardship as well, how to go to the toilet in the bush safely and respectfully and clean up after you use without leaving a trace. We teach all that stuff because everyone that goes into the bush should be looking after that and thinking about people that comes with us. And hopefully the more people that know that, we won't need some of the rules that we have because people are doing the right thing, and the rules don't exist because people aren't. But I'd like to see all hikers that are going and know how to, take, whatever you take in, you need to bring out, or you shouldn't be going in there in the first place. So all those things are what we do in our courses, and it's great fun, and every course is different. We run them in different parts of the world. For example, our Mod 1 and 2, particularly in Darwin, we run them, North Queensland, Townsville, and I usually coincide that when I'm up teaching on either the Army courses in Darwin or the Air Force Combat Survival Training School. I'm doing courses for the military up there. We'll run a civilian course afterwards. And then in Victoria, we're currently in Victoria, and we're here for a month running a series of courses here. Mod 1, 2, and our wilderness first aid one is next week. And that's students must have the Mod 1 as well, so because it's all tailor-made to that course and the skill sets you learn out in the bush. All around the country we run these courses so students can do the Mod 1 and Mod 2 in different environments. Same skill sets, but the plants and the resources change. So they've got the ability to come back and do a course a second time. That's 40% off for any second course, and they can do the same skill sets because you never learn something once. Some people come back multiple times because it keeps changing, or if the environment changes. So just to do it in a different area. So that's an important thing we do as well. And it's fun. We have about 16 people on every course. And as I said, it's all immersive. It's all in the bush. The whole thing is in the bush, and it's all in a natural environment. We try to keep things as natural possible. Some military, some, we mix things up. But I wouldn't say we're teaching military survival. I use aspects that I think are applicable from what I've learned, essential things. But other than that, we teach sort of both philosophies of bushcraft and survival because, essentially they're just words. But as I said, bushcraft being the parent subject that survival comes from. It's a modern word. Yeah, so it's hope that answers that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if any of the listeners did want to dive into this a little bit and find out more about Bushcraft Survival Australia, potentially look into a course or whatever it may be, where should they find you? What's the best place to go?
Our website is www.bushcraftsurvivalaustralia.com.au, and it's got a description of all our courses we have on there, how they work, and about us page, the qualifications, everyone's what they do, what we're about. We have a YouTube channel, which is Bushcraft Survival Australia, which we have a lot of how-to videos on there. Some have some course elements on there, so you can watch a video with that, as well as the usual social media, Facebook and Instagram, of course, which I'm not a huge fan of social media, but I understand it's not my best thing I do, but we have people that organise that stuff. So, but it's an important part. So we have lots of things on Instagram as well when I post doing things. And, we have courses pretty much all through the year, not so much in the summer season. We don't run them in bushfire season. And, you can come back multiple times and do different courses, and the bookings, you can do all the booking through Try Booking, which is on the website, and the course description. This kit lists what you need for the course. We do provide a lot of equipment as well, but all the details are on there.
Fantastic. Well, for anyone who is interested, I'll make sure there are links for all of those links in the show notes below. So if anyone wants to check that out, just scroll on below. You'll be able to get into it. But Gordon, I think this has been a fantastic episode. It's been super, super, super interesting. Just hearing to some of the points and some of the areas you've been talking about, And I feel like it's a bit of a rabbit hole that a lot of people are going to potentially dive into after this, for hopefully for the good. So thank you so much for coming on, Gordon. It's been absolutely great, and I really, really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Rowan.